40 degrees, 5 minutes, 51 seconds north. 112 degrees, 2 minutes, 13 seconds west. Located in the middle of nowhere in Alberta, Utah, USA, lies a cave that went from a site that was attracting over 5,000 visitors per year to closed forever, all because of one fateful incident, all the way back in 2009. You see, Nutty Putty Cave had a bit of a reputation. It was extremely narrow, slippery, filled with twists and turns, and lots of tight squeezes. Among all of its mapped out passageways, there were still some that were completely unknown, yet to be explored, and therefore pretty dangerous. Trigger warning for anybody who has claustrophobia, because this one is difficult to stomach even if you aren't claustrophobic. This is the story of John Edward Jones and the Nutty Putty Cave incident. Nutty Putty Cave was first explored in 1960 by a man named Dale Green. It's believed that the cave had ended up with the name Nutty Putty due to the fact that the cave had a soft brown putty-like texture in the clay that was to be found within its many tunnels by Dale Green. Nutty Putty was actually such a tight tunnel that it's never been fully surveyed. A total length of 1,355 feet or 413 meters, and a total depth of 145 feet or 44 meters was all that was officially surveyed. The original survey of the site was done in December of 2003 by 4 men. They were named John Jasper, Brandon Kowalis, Spencer Christian, and Chuck Aiklin. In a guide that is actually copyrighted against Brandon Kowalis' name, there are 5 precautions given in warning before entering Nutty Putty. Number 1. Be familiar with all of the hazards and know how well each individual will handle these hazards. Number 2. Each person in your group should have a well-fitting helmet, a head-mounted light, boots with rigid soles, and clothing for humid 60-degree Fahrenheit temperatures. The number 1 cause for caving fatalities in the state is head or neck injuries created by falls. Number 3. Leave no trace. Carry out all trash, including wrappers, food, spent batteries, human waste, containers, and clothing. Number 4. Do not squeeze into anything that you might not be able to squeeze out of. There have been several rescues and call-outs to the cave because of people getting stuck in tight passages. Number 5. All scout groups should be sure that they are abiding by the Boy Scout of America caving guidelines. Tour permits must be acquired through your local scout office. Without the proper signed permits and training, scouts will not be covered under BSA insurance or church insurance. Should an injury or death occur, the scout leaders will be held fully responsible. Yeah, Nutty Putty was actually a massive hit with Boy Scouts, which seems insanely crazy right now. Due to the cave having so many twists and turns, various portions of the cave were named accordingly. From its entrance, it looks like there are actually 2 paths, one which goes to the left and one which goes to the right. On the left-hand side of the cave, you have some rooms that are named the Maze, the Big Room, the Helmet Eater, and the Crack. And on the right-hand side, you've got the Big Slide, the Birth Canal, Ed's Push, the Aorta Crawl, the Scout Eater, and Vein Alley. It's very obvious why these are named as such. I mean, fuck that. I mean, the fact that there's one called the Scout Eater, that suggests that it's too small for even a Boy Scout to go into. In the run-up to a closure of the cave in 2006, between 1999 and 2004, 6 different people needed to be rescued from Nutty Putty. Despite Richard Downey, the treasurer of Timpanogos Grotto, which at one point managed access to Nutty Putty, he would say, "It was believed to be really easy, and that's why all of your Boy Scouts and locals went in with flashlights and sandals and things. You have to work hard to get in trouble." Surprisingly, the closure in 2006 took place due to safety concerns. It was then that Timpanogos Grotto would set up an online reservation system that would only allow a single group of explorers to be in the cave at any given time, and the entrance to the cave would be padlocked closed upon nightfall. This would actually allow the cave to reopen in May of 2009. and a mere 6 months later, disaster would strike. John Edward Jones, a 26-year-old man, decided to go on a large party trip to the Nutty Putty cave. John, along with his brother Josh and 9 other individuals, entered the cave on the 24th of November, 2009. John was actually really experienced in spelunking. He was an Eagle Scout in his youth, and he'd actually been taking on lots of caving trips with his father and his brother Josh all over Utah. John was also a devout Christian, and he'd even served on mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Quito, Ecuador, which is, I don't know if that's better than Uganda, or if you know, you know. At the time of the visit to the cave, John was actually studying to be a pediatric cardiologist, which is insanely noble and makes this even more heartbreaking. And he was a father himself, having a 13-month-old daughter at the time with his wife Emily, and she was pregnant with their second child. After entering the cave at around 8 p.m. on the 24th of November, everything was going pretty well for about an hour. The party of 11 would explore the biggest room of the cave, the Big Slide. 4 of the party, John, Josh, and 2 others, decided to take up a challenge that this cave had. And that challenge was passing through the part of the cave that was known as the birth canal. Now, I know it doesn't take a rocket surgeon to realise that this is actually a super narrow and challenging passageway, but once you pass through it, you're greeted with a very large room, and it's obviously one that not many people have explored, so that's why the challenge was taken up. As such, John would lead the way, and he would crawl and wriggle his way forward, inching closer and closer to what he thought was the large room after the birth canal. Unfortunately though, a wrong turn had been taken, meaning that John wasn't actually crawling towards the room after the birth canal. Eventually he noticed a sharp downward corner, and John would just carry on, and he went down this corner head first. It's very unknown due to conflicting reports whether or not John wriggled into the Scout Eater, which, looking at the map, seems unlikely due to having to go through the birth canal first in order to get there, or if he went into a tunnel just off the birth canal called Ed's Push. Either way, both the Scout Eater and Ed's Push have passageways that lead to seemingly nowhere. I mean, they could lead places, but they've never been surveyed, and as such, on the map, they just look like complete dead ends. Regardless of this fact, John had pushed on to a point where he was completely unable to turn around. And what's worse, the narrow fissure that he had crawled down was comparable to that of the opening of a front-loading washing machine, measuring about 10 by 18 inches or 25 by 46 centimeters. But unlike a front-loading washing machine, the opening that John had trapped himself in wasn't a perfect circle. He was trapped in by its narrowest point. After he got stuck, Josh was the first person to find his brother. He attempted to pull John back up by his calves, but he just wouldn't budge. And even if Josh couldn't lift John by his calves, he had taken a little bit of the weight. So when Josh let go, John would fall a little bit further down, having his arms become pinned to his chest and the cave wall, meaning that now John couldn't move at all. And as such, all that the devout Mormons could do was pray. Josh, on the other hand, was actually able to make his way backwards, get out, and go and get help. But his brother was trapped 400 feet inside of the cave and 100 feet below the surface of the earth. And here comes an absolute logistical nightmare. Getting the right people and then getting the right equipment in place in order to attempt to save the 26-year-old. And all of that, it was going to take time. And time wasn't something that John had. The first rescuer to make their way to John was a woman named Susie Matola. And this was around 12:30 a.m., 3.5 hours after he'd initially become trapped. John could only really hear a voice, and Susie could only really see a pair of running shoes. It's said that after Susie had introduced herself, John replied saying, "Hi Susie, thanks for coming, but I really want to get out." Over the course of the next 24 hours, a ton of rescuers would work tirelessly to try and get John out of Nutty Putty Cave and finally home to his family. The best plan that anybody could come up with was to rig up a series of pulleys and ropes to try and drag John out of this perilous situation. The only problem was the fact that the rock surrounding John was so hard and dense that drilling away chunks of rock would take way too long. For instance, after an hour of drilling, they had only managed to drill through a few inches of rock. Another area that was an issue was the position that John was in. He was upside down with only his feet visible. Pulling him out by his feet was pretty much impossible due to the fact that the ceiling was hanging so low above John. Lifting him straight up out would just have his feet hit the ceiling, plus his legs obviously don't bend in the direction that the cave was going in, unless they wanted to, snap his knees. So the pulley system was decided upon because they didn't need to go that far into the rock in order to anchor themselves. However, yet again, this was going to take time. The fact that the cave was so small meant that rigging up the pulleys was going to be insanely difficult, even just in maneuvering around to get the drills in place. Not to mention the fact that despite there was over 100 rescuers being present, comprising of rescuers, volunteers, emergency services, with a rescue helicopter waiting in the wings, all was kind of for nothing since only one person at any given time was able to access John. However, after some tireless work, the time finally came to start pulling. John at that point had been upside down for 19 hours. In an 8-man tandem, they would begin tugging in unison. With every single tug that was put on those ropes and those pulleys, it was actually an insane amount of pain being exuded onto John, and as such they would occasionally have to pause. However, every single time that they pulled on those ropes, John would come up just a little bit more each time. After the third big tug, John was high enough to be able to look up the tunnel and make eye contact with the closest rescuer to him. They would call down to him, "How are you?" He would shout back up, "It sucks. I'm upside down. I can't believe I'm upside down. My legs are killing me." And despite the complaints, John was smiling, according to the rescuer. At that point, they would pause one more time to allow John some rest. Eventually, the team was then ready to begin pulling for a 4th time, and that would be the beginning of the end. The team that was pulling John up suddenly all just fell backwards, the ropes just loose noodles in their hands, and the rescuer that was in the first position of the tandem had been hit in the face by something, and as a result, they would lose consciousness. When this person eventually came to, all they could see around them was dust, and not to use a cliche, but once that dust had settled, he saw that the arch near the legs of John had been completely shattered, with the nearest key bolt of the pulley system breaking off. A metal carabiner had been what had smashed that rescuer in the face, leaving him with very severe injuries, and as a result, they were unable to continue in their rescue efforts. But before exiting the cave, they made one harrowing note. They couldn't see John anymore. And that was when it dawned on them. John had slid right back down the fissure, and it seemed like he was now even deeper than he had been before. The rescuer who had been hit in the face, he was actually replaced by his own father, and this guy would call down to John and got no response back. Desperate at this point, the man could see that John's breathing was becoming less and less frequent and more shallow. So he actually attempted to lower himself down to John to try and retie the rope around his waist this time rather than his legs. But for a small amount of time, this actually resulted in the rescuer becoming stuck. Luckily though, he was actually able to wriggle himself free. He would then drill a new hole for the pulley system and then replaced himself with yet another rescuer to be first in the tandem. This third rescuer, they couldn't get a response from John. After noticing this, a medical professional was brought into the cave next, and after calling their way to John, they would pronounce the 26-year-old dead at midnight. Over 100 rescuers worked as hard as they possibly could for over 27 hours to try and save the life of John Edward Jones. In the day that followed, it was found that John's body would have to remain inside of the cave. This was due to the fact that authorities found that it was way too difficult and way too dangerous to remove the remains from Nutty Putty. 1 entire week following the tragic accident, the decision was made to close Nutty Putty to the public forever. The cave has been sealed shut ever since. One of the rescuers on the scene, Sean Roundy, he believes that the cave's name gives us a major insight into how the pulley above John broke, believing that the anchor point in the cave wall broke off due to the wall containing a large amount of clay that was getting looser and looser with every single tug that raised John upwards. In the years that followed after the event, Roundy would say, "I reviewed the whole mission, wishing we'd done this tiny detail differently or done that a little sooner. But it's no use second guessing things. We did our best." And in a bit of a departure from what is usually on this channel, he's right. If you look at the photos from the rescue, if you look at the tools the rescuers had to work with, if you look at how narrow the cave was and the tight working conditions that they had to operate in, it's obvious it was just a huge nightmare. This entire ordeal was such a horrific accident, and I'm genuinely glad that common sense actually prevailed for once and the cave was shut forever. In 2016, a feature-length film directed by Isaac Halasima was released named The Last Descent. This movie is about the life of John and the failed rescue attempt. The movie attempts to give you an accurate representation of what John went through and what it feels like to be trapped inside of such a claustrophobic environment like Nutty Putty. Halasima, who's actually a native of Utah, once visited Nutty Putty Cave, but never made it past the entrance, and he's actually quoted as saying, "I'd gone in it, in the front, and kind of said, that's it, that's enough." And to be honest, it's actually insanely hard to blame him. Nutty Putty Cave now actually serves as a memorial and grave site for John Edward Jones, and his family had a plaque put up on the entrance of the cave in his memory. The plaque is black and gold, and it contains a large image of John right in the center. And there's an inscription at the bottom, which reads, "On November 25th, 2009, our beloved John passed away at this site. He was a loving father, a kind husband, a loyal son, and a true and cherished friend. Those who knew John best will remember his faith and his caring heart. Thank you, John, for showing us how to make eternity our covering and our rock and our salvation as we journey here on earth. We miss you and love you always." Maybe if the pulley system had been rigged slightly differently, maybe if they'd actually decided on that system sooner, and maybe, just maybe, if John, Josh, and all of their friends had just never decided to go to Nutty Putty Cave in the first place, John would still be with us today. But everything, and I cannot stress this enough, everything that could have been done to help John was done. It's just a horrifying, terrifying, awful accident that could have happened to just about anyone, and to be perfectly honest, I'm surprised that it never happened before. Regardless of that though, it can never happen again, now that the cave is permanently sealed shut. And that was the truly awful and tragic story of John Edward Jones and the Nutty Putty Cave incident. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, it's alright to find comfort in the death and darkness.